kiss for you.
Today we're talking about, in another episode of Out of Context, we made it to episode 2, we're talking about Apple Silicon. And what I really want to examine here from an out of context perspective is Apple Silicon kind of devoid of all of the context around it from things like Intel and things like other ARM processors at the time and all that, and just really examine how the M1 series and Apple Silicon really came to be. And the first thing I'm going to talk about with this, and we're trying to answer the question of if it was really that special and if it was really, that innovative and that disruptive to what was going on outside of, the context that it might have occupied, 4 years ago. And that first step is kind of important. This chip was launched 4 years ago, right? In the start of the pandemic, in November 2020, Apple decided, hey, we're going to launch our own ARM-based processors that are going to kind of replace our older Intel ones. That's all I'll say about that for now. They were supposed to replace the Intel ones, newer model, all that stuff, and they were going to use their own architecture that they had been using previously in stuff like the iPhone and the iPad with their whole Bionic chip series. They were going to start doing something similar with stuff like the newer iPads, the MacBooks, new iPads, MacBooks, that kind of thing, mainly in, Mac desktops. That released in November 2020 and then was followed up a year later with the Pro and Max lineup for a little bit more power. That was kind of the original thing, was these new processors were all in one system, so system on chip, basically meaning everything's kind of like combined into one framework. If I can find a good diagram here, right? You have the M1 chip, and the M1 chip contains a bunch of things. So it's not just the one chip. You have the GPU here, and we have the RAM and all that. It's all kind of contained in this one chip. And so instead of just being a CPU, as it would have been previously in an Intel system where you have like the Intel CPU and a Radeon GPU, you would just have this M1 system on chip, right? It would contain your RAM, it would contain your CPU, your GPU, your memory controllers, your bus, all that stuff. Right? This kind of layout. And so this launched, and ultimately, when it launched in a couple things, right? It launched in a Mac Mini. It launched in the laptop MacBook laptops, and I think it was just the Pro at the start. And then it eventually made itself way to the MacBook Air, and then eventually to the new Mac, desktops, as well as the iPads, and then eventually that went on to something like an M2 and an M3. What I really want to examine here is, okay, so what happened with the M2? M2 was launched then in the following 6 months after the Pro models launched, right? 2020 launched the M1. Technically 2 years after, or like a year and 6 months after they released the M2s, but because the Pro models, the more power models of the M series launched in October of 2021, this becoming 6 months later kind of made sense, and it was a good cadence of releases, so it wasn't a 2-year wait. It was kind of like a 6-month wait from the larger models that people might have needed or wanted, and so it kind of felt like a good steady progression of chips. So the M2 launched, and that was obviously added to things like the iPad and the new Macs and that kind of stuff. Ultimately, what happened was the M1 was a very big success, and outside the context of what it was going up against and what the surrounding areas of it were, it was a big success because someone could go out and buy these new M2, M1, and M2 chips. And they wouldn't know that these are any different from the Intel chips that they had bought before, either from Intel and or AMD, from Dell or Lenovo or HP or any of these other manufacturers. They wouldn't know any of this. So when a normal user can just pick up a laptop and use it as any other laptop they would, they stop being able to really comprehend or need to comprehend the reason why it's different, right? The Apple Silicon and the reason it kind of felt so good to use and so fluid was because you could just pick it up and use it like a normal laptop. You didn't have to, limit yourself to what you could do because it was a new product or a new chip or a new something, right? Very few apps and very few applications and very few kind of things didn't work well with the new Apple Silicon compared to something like an Intel system, right? They just kind of worked. And that was due to a lot of reasons, but for kind of examining it from an outside perspective, one of the reasons was the fact that it was a very strong and very good competitively, system on a chip. So we have a comparison here, and I'll open it in image here, right? We had a very good comparison. This is Cinebench. It's just basically like a benchmarking tool. These aren't super relevant to real world, but what it does show you is comparative power, right? If we're going to benchmark something, we're going to give it a power. We can see that the 13-inch MacBook Pro M1, which is the first M1 device, does pretty well, right? Higher is better. And then we have something, the Mac Mini, and that's the older Mac Mini and the newer Mac Mini, still in the Core i7s. And so ultimately, all of these, you see, okay, wow, this is a pretty, high-end Mac Mini Core i7 level here, but way more power efficient, which basically meant that, like, instead of needing, 50 or 60 or 70 watts to be able to do this, you can do it in like 10 or 15. And so that power efficiency led to a couple things. It led to not only the ability to get similar scores, but also the ability to last way longer. I'm not sure if any of these have battery on them, but the battery life for something like this system, because it was drawing so little power, was a lot. It was like 10, 15, 20 hours of battery life compared to what Intel could do or what AMD could do, just because of how efficient these chips were. So they were super efficient from a performance perspective. You didn't need to worry about hampering them or moving around them or kind of working around them for things like compatibility. And that was ultimately due to what Apple ended up calling Rosetta, which is a translation layer between something like x86, which is what Intel chips and AMD chips and Windows stuff was based on, and the newer ARM systems, stuff like what your phone has. This Rosetta is a translation layer between these different architectures, and that's how it was able to get very similar performance. If this didn't exist, you have bad performance, which is what you see on, Microsoft Surface ARM laptops and that kind of thing. Those had bad performance. I'm not going to get into the context. I don't want to get into the weeds. You go from something that had bad performance to all of a sudden something that doesn't have bad performance and it's actually really good performance and is super power efficient, so you can get those battery life benefits because it has this Rosetta translation layer that lets you use Intel and x86 processes very effectively, right? That translation layer basically lets you use it very seamlessly without too much concern. So what you end up having is, throughout a 4-year history here of the Apple Silicon, you have it in smaller machines like the Mac Mini, in laptop machines like the MacBook Pro. You have the higher end versions and Pro and M1 Pro and M1 Max for that heavier duty stuff, so it's getting that heavy duty use. As well as the power efficiency, you have that iteration that you keep iterating on. Everything's basically in place to make this very successful and continuously exciting. You get a good cadence of M1 to M1 Pro, M1 Max, to M2, to M2 Pro, to M3, and having it in the different devices means some have it now, some have it later, and so you get a really nice sort of progression of, if I want a Mac Mini, it has M1, it has M2. If I want an iPad, it has up to M4 right now, right? So you get that nice progression. You get similar performance compared to other competitors. You get better battery life and better power efficiency and power consumption, which was always kind of a thing they were focusing on. And that is, again, due to things like Rosetta being very good and power efficiency being very good, and it all being kind of contained on chip, and Apple can design it and kind of do the vertical integration stuff. And so you ultimately get a very nice and compelling product because it's able to kind of go through the motions and just check off every single box right here. What that results in is high adoption rate. This is an article originally when the M1 series came out, and they were talking about like enterprise users and sort of the IT space, and how that's sort of an industry where you might see a lot of legacy use, right? A lot of legacy Intel use or AMD use, because they have to use applications that are either not supported on Mac or don't run well on Mac, or maybe Mac doesn't have the processing power to be able to take advantage of this. Well, all of a sudden we see companies like Jamf and SAP and Electric and all these other ones in school systems using this and really adopting it here. 3,500 powered Macs, 30,000 Macs of the fleet using this new silicon, and that's ultimately what you need here, is that growth, that adoption in these sectors that maybe wouldn't have chosen a Mac otherwise are now using a Mac. It's strengthening their ability to get data and figure out how we can optimize and improve this. Because one thing you got to realize is that this benefit, right, these advances and this growth don't mean anything if you ultimately can't convince people that aren't part of this ecosystem to go into it. Why would I adopt into this whole new architecture system and Rosetta and MacBooks and this efficiency thing if it's not going to benefit me? They would just stay on Intel or AMD or Windows or whatever. You don't have to do that anymore, and so you start seeing that increase in people adopting this stuff. And this is in 2021, right after the M1 Pro and M1 Max, before the M2 series that kind of really pushed something like power efficiency and performance. You can kind of see that with the one thing that was actually quite surprising across this entire space was the prices didn't actually move that much. I have an archive.org system, right? This was $1,300, which I believe was about what the base MacBook Pro was before the switch, like Intel-wise, when Intel was on like Gen 11. I believe 1,300 was about the price. Maybe it was like 1,200, but it was relatively around that same price for what you ended up getting for that. And as well, it kind of making its way to something like the iPad Pro, that I believe also stopped at like the same price, $700, $800. It wasn't in the iPhone yet. It still wasn't in the iPhone, but it was like, the new Macs, and the new Macs looked like this, and they had the M1 chip. And so you have it in the Mac Mini, the iMac, the iPad, as well as, the MacBooks and stuff. And so you really got a good plethora of devices to use it on, and because of that integration, you could kind of develop things very easily and all that. And so it didn't increase the price. And in fact, for some things like the Mac Mini, it actually decreased the price. I think the Mac Mini started at like $700. Now, that wasn't a great, base model, but you could still buy it for $700 and upgrade stuff. There would be like $1,000 or whatever. It was just really good to see a revitalized system that wasn't $1,500. Eventually, the MacBook Pros would get to something that would be about $2,000 because they kind of really stepped into that Pro line, but then they made sure the MacBook Airs kind of caught up to where the Pros used to be so that you could have that division. Pros are now for the Pros that need the SD card, the incredible screen, the speakers, and all that stuff. And the Airs were actually viable for most other applications. And so that's what you kind of see here, is that this was $1,300. It didn't increase by that much. It only started increasing when they really shifted everything over to being like a very professional focused system. But by that time, you had the Airs that kind of filled in that gap. So they did, I think, a really good job with that overall on the Pro line here. And as well with the iPad line, they also really emphasized that Pro functionality and that, the good screen and the pencil support and all that, high refresh rate, the mini LEDs and stuff. That really kind of emphasized, we need a new processor, and this is where it's going to be. This is as strong as the new iMacs that we have. These actual computers being as strong as this iPad. And that was like a big thing. It's like, wow, we have this computer desktop level chip and CPU performance and single core performance. It's as good as desktop chips in this iPad. That was really exciting, and that still is really exciting because the M4 is out, and that's kind of a similar thing with that. So you get across the entire lineup really great adoption and not an increase in price, which I think was critical for this to really work and really excel. And that's, I think, the main reason why I'm saying that this, beyond the context, was a success, because it was able to provide something at an affordable, functional price. Now, these are US prices, right? So if you're in, EU or other countries, it might have ballooned larger than this right here, but at least in the US, these prices didn't increase that much with the new Apple Silicon. So we had prices that were reasonable, we had a timeline that made sense with actual improvements, we had a translation layer that allowed these programs to just work seamlessly, and we had benefits in power efficiency that led to similar performance. There was basically very little downside other than the continued adoption that needed to happen for everything to kind of be on the same page. Well, as Apple said, it took 2 years to do that, but now we are here 2 years about a little bit later, and it's worked. I really do think it's worked. I really do think that unlike something like folding phones, which has kind of lost their hype, I'm excited to have M4 in everything, right? The M4 that they showed off is ridiculously strong, as strong as the current Intel products. And that's really exciting because M4 right now is only in the iPad. But when it comes to these systems, that's going to be crazy, especially when you have something like the ability to cool them with the MacBook Pros. We're going to see some serious level of performance with these things, even beyond what we could expect before, because it's also going to be cheaper. Like, yes, the iPad's expensive right now and the M4 stuff's expensive, but it's just going to drive the price of the previous models down. Like, okay, sure, the M4 might be really expensive because it's like technically an M2 Pro in terms of power or whatever, but it drives the other ones down. The M4 MacBook Pros, when they come out, are going to drive down the M2s, they're going to drive down the M1s, and so they're going to make this a really affordable ecosystem to kind of invest into, which I really like. The last thing that this whole system did of the M series was force its competition to also start doing well. Intel released directly after the Apple did all their thing and left them behind. they released their 12th gen series. Now, the 12th gen series is important because up to this point, this is a lot of CPU numbers, so just bear with me. But up to this point, Intel wasn't doing great. They had a kind of stagnation on their 14 nanometer process, and they weren't really pushing gains that much, and AMD was kind of destroying them. And Intel really needed some way to kind of kick back, right? Because Apple was a big supplier that they were using to kind of justify what was happening there, and sort of as everyone else was kind of slowly moving to AMD, Apple was really that steadfast, like, we're still using Intel. Then they drop Intel for their own stuff. All of a sudden, Intel's scrambling to kind of, okay, we need to get this, we need to come back in full force. That's what happened with 12th gen. It forced Intel, whether it was by design or not, to step up and be competitive. Because all of a sudden, you're not going to be able to compete with this newer stuff if you can't compete with Apple. If you can't compete there, people are just going to get MacBook. Or they're going to get a Dell, which is using AMD a lot of the time. So that's when 12th gen really, I think, worked into it well. They introduced, obviously, the performance and efficiency cores, which I think, generally speaking, worked pretty well. And it was price competitive, had the graphics and all that. And it was a very good push to something that I felt was very good for the industry as a whole. It meant more competition. It meant Intel had to kind of actually get going and figure out what it can do. It meant that AMD can't just walk all over it and be the definitive use case. It really meant that there was another option on the table, because MacBooks have always been an option, and they've always been a good option if you want certain things. Now, all of a sudden, they're just a great option across the board, so Intel doesn't have an excuse, and AMD doesn't have an excuse to kind of rest on what they've been doing, which I think was really good for the competition of all these products. So ultimately, that's kind of where I want to leave it here. If you have any discussion or any of this, or have any anecdotes you want to share about it, then leave a comment, like, subscribe, all that. And I really just want to get across that I think this was a great sort of stepping stone into this broader competition that not a lot of people seem to really talk about, right? We're so focused on forward and momentum and all that we really forget to kind of look back and see, wow, this really was a changing process here that really kind of stoked the fires of competition and of efficiency beyond what we could have really hoped for. And I think it's a massive win for Apple in general, especially with what they've been doing. And it's just kind of a tour de force in showing that it's not all about raw power. It's not all about pushing wattage and pushing direct power and then getting 300 watt CPUs and all that. It's about efficiency, and it's about making competitive CPUs and not system on chip processors, competitive processors, efficient processors, ones that everyone can use, ones that feel good to use, ones that get rid of all the bog and the bloat and stuff we've come to expect from them. It was really good, so I really hope people kind of understand that and really kind of look forward to that. So next up will be an out of context on the next episode on 3D TVs. So hope you're interested and looking forward to that.